Sarah Martinez pushed open the heavy glass door of Wilson's gun emporium, the bell above chiming softly as she stepped inside. The smell of gun oil and leather holsters filled her nostrils. Bringing back memories of her father's workshop back home in Texas, she adjusted her worn baseball cap and scanned the impressive display of firearms lining the walls. The shop was exactly what she'd expected from the reviews online. Glass cases stretched along 3 walls, filled with everything from compact pistols to hunting rifles. Behind the main counter, mounted high on the wall like a trophy, hung what she'd come to see, a Barrett M8 2A 1.50 caliber sniper rifle. Even from across the room, she could appreciate its imposing presence. 3 men stood behind the counter, engaged in animated conversation about the upcoming hunting season. The oldest, probably in his 60s, with a gray beard, wore a name tag reading Wilson and seemed to be the owner. The other 2 appeared to be employees, both younger but sharing the same confident swagger that came with years of handling firearms. Sarah approached the counter, her boots clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. She'd dressed practically for this visit: jeans, a simple flannel shirt, and sturdy boots. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw unnecessary attention. She'd learned long ago that sometimes it was better to blend in, especially in situations where her presence might be questioned. "Excuse me," she said politely, waiting for the men to acknowledge her. "I'm interested in looking at the Barrett up there." The conversation stopped abruptly. Wilson looked up from the catalog he'd been flipping through, his eyes taking in Sarah's appearance with obvious skepticism. The 2 younger men exchanged glances, and she caught the hint of smirks playing at their lips. "The Barrett?" Wilson repeated, as if he'd misheard her. "You mean the M8 201? "Yes, sir. That's the one." Wilson set down his catalog and crossed his arms. "Miss, that's a .50 caliber rifle. It weighs 32 pounds and has a recoil that'll knock most grown men on their backs. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being underestimated, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm quite sure. I've done my research on the specifications." One of the younger employees, a man with a crew cut and arms covered in tattoos, let out a low chuckle. "Research is one thing, sweetheart. Actually handling one of those beasts is something else entirely. Name's Derek," he continued, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed more condescending than friendly. "I've been shooting for 15 years, and I'll tell you right now, that Barrett isn't something you just pick up and shoot. It's designed for military snipers and serious long-range competitors." Sarah shook his hand briefly, noting the calluses that spoke to his experience with firearms. "I appreciate the concern, but I'd still like to take a look at it." The third man, younger still with sandy brown hair, joined the conversation. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be rude, but we get a lot of people in here who think they can handle military-grade equipment after watching a few YouTube videos. That rifle up there costs more than most people's cars." Wilson nodded in agreement. "Tommy's right. We're talking about a $12,000 piece of equipment. The ammunition alone costs about $5 per round. It's not exactly something you can just try out on a whim." Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She'd anticipated this reaction and come prepared. "I understand the cost and the specifications. I also understand that you run a business and need to protect your investments. Would a pre-approval letter from my bank help establish that I'm a serious buyer?" Wilson took the paper, unfolded it, and his eyebrows rose slightly as he read the figures. The letter showed pre-approval for a loan amount well above the rifle's cost. He handed it back to her, but his expression remained skeptical. "Money isn't the only consideration here," he said carefully. "That rifle requires proper training, proper licensing, and honestly, the physical capability to handle it safely. No offense, but you're maybe what, 5'5"? 120 pounds soaking wet." 5'6" actually, Sarah corrected with a slight smile, and 125. Derek laughed outright at this. "See what I mean? That rifle's recoil would send you flying backwards. We've had guys twice your size struggle with it." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "Just last month, this guy came in here, probably 6'2", claimed he was Special Forces. Put him on our range with the Barrett, and he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Nearly dislocated his shoulder, too. Sarah listened to their concerns, understanding their perspective, even as it frustrated her. She'd encountered this attitude before in different contexts and different places. The assumption that her size and gender automatically disqualified her from certain activities was something she'd been fighting against her entire life. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice remaining calm and respectful, "I understand your concerns about safety and capability. What would it take for you to let me examine the rifle? Not fire it, just look at it up close." Wilson considered this for a moment, exchanging glances with his employees. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in letting you look. But I want to be clear. Looking is all we're talking about here. Even if you decide you want to purchase it, we'd require you to complete an extensive safety course first." "That seems reasonable," Sarah agreed. Derek pulled a small ladder from behind the counter and positioned it below the Barrett. He climbed up and carefully lifted the rifle from its mounting brackets, handling it with obvious respect and familiarity. The rifle was indeed impressive, nearly 4 feet long, with its distinctive muzzle brake and bipod legs folded. Beneath the barrel, he carried it down and placed it gently on a padded mat on the counter. "Here she is. But remember, no touching without permission." Sarah studied the rifle intently, her eyes taking in every detail. The craftsmanship was evident in every component, from the precisely machined receiver to the adjustable stock. She could see why it commanded such respect and such a hefty price tag. "It's beautiful," she said softly, genuine appreciation in her voice. Wilson seemed pleased by her respectful attitude. "It really is a work of art, but it's also a serious responsibility. This isn't a hunting rifle or a target shooter for weekend fun. This is a precision instrument designed for very specific purposes." Sarah nodded, still studying the rifle. "I understand that completely. The question is, what would it take to convince you that I could handle that responsibility?" The 3 men exchanged looks again. She could see them struggling with how to answer that question without appearing discriminatory, while still expressing their genuine concerns about her capabilities. Sarah's mind drifted back to the reason she was standing in this gun shop, fighting for the right to be taken seriously. It had been 3 months since she'd received the call that changed everything. She was in her small apartment in Colorado Springs, grading papers from her physics students at the local community college when her phone rang. "Sarah? This is Colonel Peterson from Fort Carson." The voice was crisp, professional, but she could hear something else underneath: urgency, maybe even desperation. Her father had served under Peterson years ago. Before a roadside bomb in Afghanistan ended his military career and started his long battle with PTSD, Sarah had met the colonel only once. At her father's funeral 2 years earlier, "Colonel Peterson," she'd replied, setting down her red pen. "How can I help you?" "I need to ask you about your father's stories. Specifically, the ones about teaching you to shoot." Sarah had felt her chest tighten. Her father had been proud of her marksmanship abilities, perhaps too proud. He'd often told anyone who would listen. About his daughter who could shoot the wings off, fly at 500 yards? She'd always assumed these were just a father's exaggerated boasts. He may have embellished a bit. "Sir," she'd said carefully, "maybe. But I'm in a situation where I need to know exactly how much was embellishment and how much was truth. We've got a training exercise coming up, and I need a civilian demonstration of long-range precision shooting. All my regular contractors are tied up with other assignments." Colonel had explained that the exercise was designed to train new reconnaissance teams in working with sniper support. They needed someone who could demonstrate the capabilities of the Barrett M82A1 at distances beyond 1,000 yards, in conditions that would challenge even experienced shooters. "The thing is," Peterson had continued, "your father always claimed you were better than any of his military-trained shooters. He said you had a natural gift that couldn't be taught." Sarah had laughed softly at that. "Colonel, with all due respect, my father also claimed I was the prettiest girl in 3 counties and smart enough to be president. He wasn't exactly objective when it came to his daughter. Maybe not. But he was objective about shooting. In 20 years of service, I never knew him to exaggerate about anything related to marksmanship. He was too serious about it for that. That conversation had led to others, and eventually to Colonel Peterson's offer. If she could demonstrate her abilities with the Barrett system, she would be contracted to provide shooting demonstrations for military training exercises. The pay was substantial, but more importantly, it was a chance to honor her father's memory in a meaningful way. The problem was, she hadn't touched a rifle in over a year. After her father's death, being around firearms brought back to many painful memories of their time together at the range. He taught her to shoot when she was 12, starting with a .22 rifle and gradually working up to more powerful weapons as her skills developed. By the time she was 16, she was consistently outperforming adult shooters at local competitions. Her father had been thrilled, seeing in her a continuation of his own military legacy. But Sarah had been more interested in academics, eventually earning a degree in physics and settling into a quiet teaching career. Now, standing in Wilson's gun emporium, she realized how much she'd missed the precise science of long-range shooting. The calculations involved in accounting for wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric conditions had always appealed to her analytical mind. It was physics in its purest form, mathematics translated. Into physical reality, Wilson's voice brought her back to the present. Look, miss, I can see you're serious about this. But understanding the theory and actually handling the rifle are two very different things. Sarah looked up from the Barrett, meeting his eyes directly. You're absolutely right. Theory and practice are different things. But you're making assumptions about my practical experience based on my appearance. Derek crossed his arms. It's not just appearance. It's basic physics. That rifle produces about 25 foot-pounds of recoil energy. For someone your size, that's going to be a significant challenge. Actually, Sarah said, her teacher instincts kicking in. It's not just about size. It's about technique, positioning, and understanding how to manage the forces involved. The muzzle brake reduces felt recoil by about 30%, and proper body positioning can distribute the remaining force effectively.
Mommy looks skeptical.
You sound like you've read the manual. But reading about something and experiencing it are totally different. Sarah nodded. You're right again, but here's what I'm asking. What would it take for you to give me a chance to prove what I can do? Not here in the shop, obviously, but at a proper range facility. Wilson stroked his beard thoughtfully. Well, we do have an arrangement with Mountain View Range about 20 miles south of here. They've got lanes that go out to 1,200 yards. Perfect, Sarah said. What if I paid for range time and ammunition, and you brought the Barrett out there? If I can't handle it safely, we call it off immediately. If I can demonstrate competency, then we discuss a purchase. The three men exchanged glances again. Sarah could see they were wavering, caught between their instincts to protect their equipment and their curiosity about whether she could actually back up her confident words. Insurance liability alone, ... double quotes Wilson began. I'll sign whatever. Waivers you need, Sarah interrupted. Full responsibility for any damage or injury. Derek laughed, but it wasn't entirely mocking now. You're either really confident or really crazy. Maybe a little of both, Sarah admitted with a smile. But I'm also really serious about this. I'm not here on a whim or because I think it would be fun to try. I have specific professional reasons for needing to demonstrate competency with this rifle system. It caught Wilson's attention. Professional reasons? Sarah pulled out her phone and showed them the email chain with Colonel Peterson. I've been asked to provide shooting demonstrations for military training exercises, but I need to prove I can handle the equipment first. Wilson read through the emails, his expression growing more serious. These are legitimate military contracts.
Is there?
Which is why I need to know this rifle inside and out. It's not just about being able to shoot it. I need to understand its capabilities and limitations well enough to demonstrate them to military personnel. Tommy whistled softly. That changes things a bit. Derek nodded slowly. Military contractors don't mess around with unqualified personnel. If they're considering you for this kind of work, then maybe, Wilson said carefully, we should give you that chance to prove yourself. He paused, studying her face. But I want to be clear about something. If you can't handle that rifle safely, or if you're not as competent as you claim to be, this ends immediately. No arguments, No second chances. Sarah extended her hand. Deal. Wilson shook it, and she could feel the calluses from decades of handling firearms. All right then. Mountain View Range, this Saturday morning. We'll meet there at 8 a.m. sharp. Bring your identification, your bank letter, and any other documentation you think might be relevant. As Sarah walked back to her car, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She'd gotten her chance, but now she had to deliver. The next few days would be spent preparing both mentally and physically for what might be the most important shooting demonstration of her life. The days leading up to Saturday crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her regular teaching duties, her mind constantly drifting to the upcoming demonstration. She spent her evenings reviewing ballistics tables and refreshing her memory on the technical specifications of the Barrett M82A1. Thursday evening, she drove to a local sporting goods store and purchased shooting gloves, ear protection, and safety glasses. The young clerk seemed surprised by her methodical selection of professional-grade equipment, but she ignored his curious looks. She also bought a small notebook to record data during the shooting session. Friday night, she barely slept. Her dreams were filled with memories of shooting with her father, the smell of gunpowder, the satisfying ring of steel targets being hit at long range, and his proud smile when she made particularly difficult shots. But mixed with these pleasant memories were doubts. What if the men at Wilson's were right? What if she really couldn't handle the Barrett's power? What if her father's stories had been exaggerated after all? Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast, with a light wind that would make long-range shooting more challenging. Sarah arrived at Mountain View Range 15 minutes early, her stomach churning with nervous energy. The facility was more impressive than she'd expected. A modern building surrounded by carefully maintained shooting lanes that stretched into the distance. Wilson's truck was already in the parking lot, and she could see the men setting up equipment at one of the longer-range stations. Derek was assembling a spotting scope, while Tommy laid out what appeared to be several boxes of ammunition. Wilson himself was carefully removing the Barrett from a hard case. His movements precise and respectful, Sarah parked and walked toward them, her new shooting bag slung over her shoulder. She dressed practically again, sturdy pants, a long-sleeved shirt, and boots with good grip. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail to keep it out of her face. Morning, Wilson called out as she approached. Ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be, Sarah replied, though her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Derek looked up from the spotting scope. We've set up targets at 300, 600, and 900 yards. Figured we'd start close and work our way out, assuming you can handle the near targets. Tommy gestured to the ammunition boxes. We brought match-grade rounds minus 750 grain Hornady Max. Same stuff the military uses for precision work. Sarah nodded, recognizing the specifications. Good choice. What's the wind reading? Wilson checked a small electronic device. Variable between 5 and 8 miles per hour, coming from our 10 o'clock position. Not ideal conditions for precision shooting? Actually, Sarah said, surprising them, wind makes it more interesting. Static conditions don't really test your ability to read environmental factors. The four of them walked to the shooting position Wilson had selected. The Barrett was set up on a solid concrete bench with sandbags for support. Even at rest, the rifle commanded respect. Its massive barrel and distinctive muzzle brake gave it an unmistakably military appearance. All right, Wilson said, his tone becoming more serious. Before we start, let's go over some safety rules. This rifle is always treated as loaded, even when we know it isn't. Muzzle discipline is critical. That thing is pointed downrange at all times. And nobody, and I mean nobody, goes forward of the firing line while there's ammunition anywhere near this rifle. Sarah nodded. Understood. Derek pulled out a pair of electronic ear protection. You'll want these. The Barrett is loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage, even outdoors. Sarah put on the ear protection and safety glasses, then approached the rifle. Up close, she could appreciate the precision engineering that went into its construction. Every component was designed for accuracy and reliability under extreme conditions. Mind if I check the scope adjustment? She asked. Wilson gestured for her to proceed. Sarah examined the Leupold scope mounted on the rifle, checking its adjustment turrets and reticle. The scope was zeroed for 100 yards, which meant she'd need to calculate elevation adjustments for the longer-range targets. The ballistics chart for this load shows about 18 inches of drop at 300 yards, she said. More to herself than to the others. With this wind, I'll need about 6 inches of left adjustment. Tommy raised an eyebrows. You calculated that in your head? Physics background, Sarah explained. Ballistics is just applied mathematics. Wilson stepped beside her. All right, let's see how you handle the rifle itself. Remember, it weighs 32 pounds, so take your time getting positioned. Sarah approached the Barrett methodically. She adjusted the height of the sandbags supporting the rifle, then positioned herself behind it. The stock felt solid against her shoulder, and she was pleased to find that the length of pull was comfortable for her frame. Bipod's already deployed, Derek noted. That'll help with stability. Sarah looked through the scope, acquiring the 300-yard target. It was a standard bullseye target, clearly visible through the high-quality optics. She could see why precision shooters preferred this scope. The reticle was crisp, and the image was bright despite the overcast conditions. Before I shoot, she said, I want to calculate the exact holdover. She pulled out her notebook and began scribbling numbers. Wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, elevation, all factors that would affect the bullet's trajectory. Wilson watched her work with growing interest. Most people just aim and shoot. Most people don't hit what they're aiming at beyond 300 yards. Sarah replied without looking up from her calculations. She finished her math and made adjustments to the scope's turrets. The clicks were precise and positive, each one representing a quarter-inch of adjustment at 100 yards. For the 300-yard target, she dialed in 7 clicks of elevation and 3 clicks of left windage. Ready, she announced. Derek positioned himself behind the spotting scope. I'll call your shots. Tommy, you spot the impacts, if she misses. Sarah settled in behind the rifle, controlling her breathing as her father had taught her years ago. The proper shooting position came back to her naturally, body aligned behind the rifle, left hand supporting the stock, right hand gripping the pistol grip with her index finger, resting lightly on the trigger. She could feel the men watching her intently, probably expecting her to struggle with the rifle's weight or to flinch when she fired. Instead, she felt a calm settle over her that she recognized from her competitive shooting days. This was familiar territory. Through the scope, the target seemed impossibly clear. She could see the individual scoring rings, even make out small imperfections in the paper. Her breathing slowed, and she began the mental countdown her father had drilled into her. The trigger on the Barrett was surprisingly crisp for such a large rifle. Sarah applied steady pressure, feeling the resistance build until the rifle fired with a thunderous boom that echoed across the range. The recoil was substantial, but manageable. Her body position absorbed most of the energy, and the muzzle brake did its job in reducing the felt recoil. She immediately worked the bolt, chambering another round while maintaining her sight picture. Center ring, Derek called out, his voice tinged with surprise. Dead center of the bullseye. Wilson lowered his binoculars. Well, I'll be damned. Sarah remained focused on the target, making a small adjustment to her windage. The first shot had been perfect, but she wanted to see if she could repeat it. The second shot followed quickly, the rifle's report echoing across the range again. Same place, Derek announced. You've got 2 shots touching in the center ring. Tommy whistled softly. Beginner's luck? Sarah finally looked up from the scope, a slight smile on her face. Let's find out. What's the wind reading for the 600-yard target? Wilson checked his wind meter again. His attitude toward Sarah noticeably changed after witnessing her first 2 perfect shots. Winds picked up to about 10 miles per hour, still from the left. That 600-yard target is going to be significantly more challenging. Sarah nodded, already working through the calculations in her head. The increased distance would magnify every small error in reading the wind. In her shooting position, in the rifle's mechanical precision. At 600 yards, a tiny mistake at the muzzle would translate to inches of error on target. The ballistics chart shows about 68 inches of drop at that distance, she said, making notes in her book. With this wind, I'm looking at probably 14 inches of drift. Derek peered through his spotting scope at the distant target. That's a standard military silhouette target. Much smaller aiming point than the bullseye you just shot. Sarah made her scope adjustments methodically, each click deliberate and calculated. The mathematics of long-range shooting had always fascinated her. The way multiple variables interacted to determine where a bullet would impact. Temperature affected powder burn rate, humidity changed air density, altitude modified ballistic coefficients. It was physics in action. As she settled back into position behind the Barrett, a black SUV pulled into the range parking lot. Sarah noticed it peripherally, but remained focused on her task. Through the scope, the 600-yard target looked impossibly small. The human silhouette barely visible, even with the high magnification optics. She controlled her breathing, letting her natural respiratory pause extend as she prepared to fire. The trigger press was smooth and deliberate, and once again the Barrett roared across the range. Hit, Derek called immediately. Center mass, just slightly left of center. Sarah worked the bolt and fired again without hesitation. The second shot followed the first by mere seconds. Another hit, same area. You've got a tight group in the center of the silhouette. Tommy shook his head in amazement. I've seen military-trained snipers struggle with those shots, especially in this wind. From behind them came the sound of approaching footsteps. Sarah glanced back to see 3 men in military uniforms walking toward their shooting position. The lead figure was an older officer with silver eagles on his collar, a full colonel. The 2 men flanking him appeared to be junior officers. Wilson straightened unconsciously as the military personnel approached. "Morning, Colonel." "Didn't expect to see you out here today," Wilson the colonel nodded. "Mind if we observe? We heard some Barrett fire and wanted to see who was shooting." Sarah recognized the voice immediately, even before she saw his face clearly. It was Colonel Peterson, the man who had offered her the military contract work. Her heart rate spiked as she realized the implications of his presence. "Of course, sir," Wilson replied. "We're just conducting a shooting evaluation." Colonel Peterson's eyes found Sarah behind the rifle, and she saw recognition dawn on his face. He'd clearly not expected to find her here at this range with these particular shop owners. "Miss Martinez," he said formally. "What a pleasant surprise." Derek and Tommy exchanged glances, suddenly understanding that this was more than a casual encounter. Wilson looked between Sarah and the colonel with obvious confusion. "Colonel Peterson," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure despite the unexpected turn of events. "I didn't know you used this range. You don't usually." "We were passing by and heard the distinctive sound of a .50 caliber rifle. My curiosity got the better of me." He gestured to the target downrange. "Mind if I ask how you're doing with your shooting evaluation?" Wilson found his voice. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, how do you know Ms. Martinez?" Colonel Peterson smiled slightly. "Ms. Martinez has been recommended for some specialized contract work with the military. Her qualifications were impressive on paper. I'm very interested to see how they translate to practical application." One of the junior officers, a captain with a name tag reading Morrison, stepped forward with a pair of binoculars. "Permission to check the targets, sir?" "Granted." Captain Morrison walked downrange to examine the targets Sarah had engaged. Through the spotting scope, the others could see him studying the 300-yard bullseye target. Then moving to the 600-yard silhouette, Colonel Wilson said carefully, "I have to admit, we were skeptical when Ms. Martinez first came to the shop. We didn't think, ... that a woman could handle a Barrett rifle." Colonel Peterson finished. "I understand the sentiment. It's not exactly standard equipment for most civilian shooters, regardless of gender." Morrison returned from checking targets, his expression thoughtful. "Sir, the 300-yard target has 2 shots in a group you could cover with a quarter. The 600-yard target has 2 shots in the center mass, grouped within about 2 inches. The second junior officer, a lieutenant, whistled softly. "That's expert-level shooting, especially in these wind conditions." Colonel Peterson nodded approvingly. "Ms. Martinez, I believe we discussed a demonstration at 900 yards. Are you prepared for that distance?" Sarah felt all eyes on her. This was the moment that would determine everything: her credibility with Wilson and his crew. her viability for the military contract, and her own confidence in her abilities. Yes, sir. I'd like to attempt the 900-yard target. Derek looked through his spotting scope at the distant target. That's just a 12-inch steel gong at that range. Much smaller target, and the wind's going to have a major effect on the bullet. Sarah began her calculations for the longest shot of the day. At 900 yards, the bullet would drop over 200 inches and take more than a second to reach the target. The wind would have that entire flight time to push the bullet off course. The flight time at this distance means the wind effect is cumulative, she explained, more for Colonel Peterson's benefit than the others. I need to read not just the wind at the firing point, but estimate the wind along the entire bullet path. She studied the grass and vegetation between her position and the target, looking for visual indicators of wind direction and velocity. At different points along the bullet's trajectory, she could see the wind was variable, stronger in some areas, lighter in others. This is where experience and instinct become as important as mathematics, she said. Making her final scope adjustments, Colonel Peterson moved to where he could observe both Sarah and the target through binoculars. Take your time, Ms. Martinez. This shot will tell us a lot about your capabilities. Sarah settled behind the Barrett for what she knew was the most important shot of her life. The steel target was barely visible at 900 yards, appearing as little more than a glint of metal through the scope. The wind had increased slightly. She could see grass moving in complex patterns between her position and the target. She controlled her breathing, letting her body settle into perfect stillness. The trigger came back smoothly, and the Barrett fired with its characteristic thunder. For a moment, everyone waited in silence. At that distance, it took nearly a second and a half for the bullet to reach the target. Then, faintly but distinctly, they heard the metallic ring of bullet striking steel. Hit, Derek shouted, dead center on the gong. Colonel Peterson lowered his binoculars, his expression unreadable. The range fell silent, except for the wind rustling through the grass. Ms. Martinez, he said finally, I think we need to talk. Colonel Peterson gestured toward a picnic table near the range office. Ms. Martinez, if you could join me for a moment? Wilson, gentlemen, would you mind giving us some privacy? Sarah followed the colonel to the table, her mind racing. The successful shots had given her confidence. But Peterson's serious demeanor suggested this conversation would be more complex than she'd anticipated. Captain Morrison and the lieutenant remained at a respectful distance, close enough to provide security, but far enough to allow private conversation. Your father wasn't exaggerating, Peterson said without preamble as they sat down. In fact, based on what I just witnessed, he may have been understating your abilities. Thank you, sir. But I get the feeling there's more to this than training demonstrations. Peterson leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. You're correct. The training exercises I mentioned are real, but they're only part of what we're dealing with. We have a situation that requires someone with very specific qualifications. He paused, studying her face carefully. What I'm about to tell you is classified. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Yes, sir. 3 weeks ago, we received intelligence about a potential terrorist threat. Foreign operatives planning an attack on a military installation. The problem is, conventional law enforcement and military response might not be sufficient to prevent it. Sensing there was much more to come, the attack is planned for a military ceremony, a change of command event with high-ranking officials present. Intelligence suggests the attackers plan to use long-range sniper fire from outside the normal security perimeter. Beyond the range of typical protective details, how far? Sarah asked. Preliminary intelligence suggests they may attempt shots from 1,500 to 2,000 yards, distances that require exceptional skill and specialized equipment. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, and you need someone who can counter that threat. We need someone who can both understand the capabilities of long-range shooting and potentially neutralize threats at those distances. Our regular military snipers are excellent, but this situation calls for someone with a different skill set. Peterson pulled out a tablet and showed her satellite imagery of a military base. This is Fort Marshall in Virginia. The ceremony is scheduled for next month. Intelligence indicates the attack will come from these hills to the east of the base. Sarah studied the imagery, her physics background helping her visualize the ballistics involved. That's incredibly challenging terrain. Multiple elevation changes, variable wind conditions. Even with the best equipment, those would be extremely difficult shots.
Exactly.
Which is why we need someone who not only understands the technical challenges, but can actually execute at that level. Your demonstration today proves you have the technical skills. The question is whether you're prepared for the responsibility. The weight of what Peterson was asking settled on Sarah's shoulders. This wasn't about training exercises or demonstrations. This was about potentially saving lives, about preventing a terrorist attack that could kill dozens of military personnel and their families. What would my role be specifically? You would be part of a counter-sniper team. Your job would be to provide overwatch during the ceremony, identify potential threats, and if necessary, neutralize them before they could engage their targets. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Colonel, I'm a physics teacher. I can shoot, obviously, but I'm not a soldier. I've never been in a combat situation. I understand your concerns, but sometimes the best person for a job isn't the obvious choice. You have skills that our traditional snipers don't possess. Your scientific background allows you to calculate complex ballistics problems that others might struggle with. And frankly, you just demonstrated shooting abilities that rival our best marksmen. Peterson gestured back toward the range where Wilson and his crew were still discussing Sarah's performance. Those men have seen hundreds of shooters over the years. I could tell from their expressions that what you just did was exceptional. But there's a difference between target shooting and operational shooting. The stress, the pressure, the knowledge that lives depend on your decisions. That changes everything. You're absolutely right. Which is why, if you agree to this, you'll undergo intensive training with our special operations teams. 2 weeks of preparation that will simulate the stress and conditions you might face. Sarah looked out at the target she'd just engaged, thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been grading physics papers and wondering if she'd ever find a way to honor her father's memory. Now, she was being asked to use the skills he'd taught her to potentially save lives. What happens if I say no? Then we proceed with conventional security measures and hope our intelligence is wrong about the range and capability of the threat. But I'll be honest with you, if our information is accurate, conventional measures may not be sufficient. Peterson's tablet chimed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, and his expression grew more serious. What is it? Sarah asked. Updated intelligence. The threat assessment has been elevated. We now have confirmation that the attackers have acquired Barrett. Mate 2A1 rifles and have been training at extended ranges. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. They have the same equipment I was just shooting. Exactly. Which means they're planning shots at the absolute limits of what's possible with current technology. We need someone who can match their capabilities and exceed them. Back at the shooting position, Wilson approached cautiously. Colonel, I don't mean to interrupt, but we couldn't help noticing the serious nature of your conversation. Is there anything we can do to help? Peterson looked at Sarah, then back at Wilson. Actually, there might be. Ms. Martinez may need access to additional equipment and training facilities. Would you be willing to work with us on that? Wilson's expression grew serious. If this is a matter of national security, absolutely. We've always supported our military personnel. Derek and Tommy had joined them, and Derek spoke up. Sir, if you don't mind me saying, we owe Ms. Martinez an apology. We made assumptions based on her appearance, and we were wrong. Tommy nodded in agreement. What she just did with that Barrett, I've never seen anything like it. Not from civilian shooters and not from most military shooters either. Sarah stood up from the picnic table, decision crystallizing in her mind. Colonel Peterson, I need to ask you something directly. Do you really believe I'm the right person for this? Not because I'm the only option available, but because I'm actually the best choice. Peterson met her eyes directly. Ms. Martinez, I've been in the military for 28 years. I've worked with some of the finest marksmen this country has ever produced. Based on what I just witnessed, combined with your analytical abilities and your motivation to serve, I believe you may be exactly what this situation requires. He paused, letting his words sink in. But I want to be clear about something else. This won't be easy. The training will push you to your limits. The responsibility will be enormous. And if you accept this assignment, there's no guarantee you'll come through it unchanged. Sarah thought about her father, about the pride he'd felt when teaching her to shoot, about the skills he'd passed down that she'd let lie dormant for too long. She thought about the ceremony Peterson had described, about the families who would be present, about the soldiers whose lives might depend on her abilities. When do we start training? She asked. Peterson smiled for the first time since arriving at the range. As soon as you're ready to begin. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself lying prone on a hillside in the mountains of Colorado, her body aching from 12 days of the most intensive training she'd ever experienced. The Barrett M82A1 was positioned in front of her, its bipod legs dug firmly into the rocky ground. Through the scope, she could see targets positioned at various distances, up to 1,800 yards. Wind shifting, called Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, her primary training instructor. Reading 12 miles per hour from your 2 o'clock, gusting to 15. Sarah made minute adjustments to her scope, her movements now automatic after nearly 2 weeks of constant practice. The military training had been unlike anything she'd anticipated. It wasn't just about shooting. They'd taught her camouflage techniques, radio communications, threat assessment, and how to operate under extreme stress. Target acquired, she reported into her radio. Range 1,800 yards, adult male target with simulated weapon. Cleared to engage, came the response from the observation post. Sarah controlled her breathing, her body settling into the perfect stillness that had become second nature. The trigger broke cleanly, and 1,800 yards away, the target snapped backward. Center mass hit, Rodriguez confirmed through his spotting scope. Time from target acquisition to engagement? 11 seconds. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. Outstanding work, Martinez. That's your best time yet at that distance. Sarah worked the bolt and chambered another round, scanning for additional targets. This exercise simulated the exact scenario they expected to face at Fort Marshall. Multiple potential threat positions, variable weather conditions, and the pressure of making split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. Movement at target position 7, she reported, acquiring a new threat through her scope. Confirmed hostile, Rodriguez said. Adult male with weapon, range 2,100 yards. Sarah felt her heart rate spike. 2,100 yards was beyond what they'd previously practiced, pushing the Barrett system to its absolute limits. At that distance, the bullet would take nearly 3 seconds to reach the target, and the wind would have that entire time to affect its trajectory. She quickly ran the calculations in her head, factoring in the increased range, the current wind conditions, and the elevation difference between her position and the target. The mathematics were complex, but weeks of training had made the process instinctive. Taking the shot, she announced, making her final scope adjustments. The rifle thundered, and Sarah immediately began tracking the bullet's flight through her scope. At extreme distances like this, she could actually watch the bullet's trajectory. Seeing how the wind affected its path during the long flight time, Miss Rodriguez called, "About 6 inches left." Sarah quickly calculated the correction needed and fired again. This time, the distant target fell. Hit, Rodriguez confirmed. Impressive recovery. Colonel Peterson's voice came through her radio. Martinez, report to the command post. We need to brief you on the latest intelligence. Sarah secured her rifle and made her way down the hillside to a camouflage tent that served as the training command center. Inside, Peterson was studying satellite imagery on multiple computer screens. Captain Morrison and 2 other officers she didn't recognize were present as well. Sarah, Peterson said, using her first name for the first time since training began, we've received updated intelligence on the threat. It's both better and worse than we initially thought. He gestured to one of the screens, which showed high-resolution imagery of the hills surrounding Fort Marshall. The good news is, we've identified the most likely positions for the attack. 3 potential sites, all within a 2-mile radius of the ceremony location. What's the bad news? Sarah asked. We now know there are at least 4 attackers, not the 2 we originally expected. And they've been conducting their own training at a facility in Montana. Our surveillance suggests they're highly skilled. Peterson pulled up video footage from a drone. This was taken 3 days ago at their training site. Watch this shot. Sarah watched as one of the figures in the video engaged a target at what appeared to be extreme range. Even through the grainy footage, she could see the target react to a hit. Rangefinder puts that shot at 1,900 yards, Morrison said. These aren't amateurs. Sarah studied the imagery, her tactical training kicking in. If they have 4 shooters at 3 positions, they could create overlapping fields of fire. Much harder to counter than a single sniper. Exactly, Peterson agreed. Which is why we're modifying the mission plan. You won't be operating alone. We're positioning 2 additional counter-sniper teams at different locations. He showed her the updated deployment plan. Your position will be here on Ridgepoint, approximately 2,000 yards from the ceremony site. You'll have the longest range and the most difficult shots, but also the best overall view of the suspected threat positions. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again. What about backup? If I miss, or if there are more threats than we've identified? The other teams will be positioned closer, with ranges between 800 and 1,200 yards. But intelligence suggests the primary threat will come from the positions only you can effectively cover. One of the officers she didn't recognize stepped forward. Ms. Martinez. I'm Agent Thompson from the FBI's hostage rescue team. I want you to understand that this operation has the highest priority classification. The ceremony includes the Joint Chiefs of Staff and several foreign military leaders. If this attack succeeds, the implications extend far beyond the immediate casualties. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. When is the operation? 72 hours, Peterson replied. We'll move to Fort Marshall tomorrow for final preparations and rehearsals at the actual site. Thompson continued the briefing. The ceremony begins at 1000 hours. Based on our intelligence, the attack will likely come during the change of command speech, when the maximum number of high-value targets will be stationary and exposed. Sarah studied the aerial photographs of Fort Marshall, memorizing the terrain and potential sight lines. What about civilian evacuations? If shooting starts at these ranges, there's potential for collateral damage. The ceremony area will be cleared of all non-essential personnel, Morrison assured her. Only military personnel and specifically vetted guests will be present. Peterson leaned back in his chair. Sarah, I need to ask you directly, are you ready for this? Not just technically, but mentally and emotionally. Sarah thought about the past 2 weeks of training, about the skills she'd developed and the confidence she'd gained. She thought about her father and the pride he'd felt in her abilities. Most importantly, she thought about the lives that would be at risk if she failed. Sir, good, because there's one more thing we need to discuss. Peterson's expression grew even more serious. Intelligence suggests the attackers know we're aware of their plan. They may try to alter their timeline or approach. We need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll attack before the ceremony, or from positions we haven't identified, Agent Thompson added. Which means you need to be prepared to make decisions in real time. Without specific target assignments or predetermined engagement zones, the scenario was becoming more complex and dangerous than anything they'd trained for. You're saying I might have to identify and engage threats on my own initiative? Exactly. You'll have overall tactical command of the counter-sniper operation. The other teams will follow your lead based on what you observe from your position. The weight of command responsibility was something Sarah had never experienced. In her teaching career, her decisions affected test scores and graduation rates. Now, her decisions could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of people. I understand, she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. Peterson stood up. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, we start the final phase of preparation. By this time next week, this will all be over. One way or another, as Sarah walked back to her quarters, she realized that in 72 hours, she would find out if all her training, all her natural ability, and all her father's lessons would be enough when it truly mattered. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cold at Fort Marshall. Sarah had been in position on Ridge Point since before sunrise, her Barrett M82A1 carefully concealed among the rocks and vegetation. Through her scope, she had a commanding view of the ceremony site nearly 2,000 yards below, as well as the 3 suspected sniper positions identified by intelligence. "Alpha team in position," she whispered into her radio, using the call sign assigned to her for the operation. "Bravo team set," came the response. From the closer counter-sniper position, "Charlie, team ready," reported the third. "Team," Colonel Peterson's voice crackled through her earpiece from the command post. "All teams, ceremony begins in 30 minutes. Maintain radio silence except for threat identification." Sarah settled in behind her rifle, scanning the distant hills through her scope. The morning light was perfect for long-range observation, and she could clearly see each of the suspected positions. So far, everything appeared normal. At exactly 1000 hours, the ceremony began. Through her scope, Sarah could see the gathered military officials taking their positions on the reviewing stand. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were clearly visible, along with several foreign military leaders whose presence made this ceremony a high-value target. 20 minutes into the ceremony, Sarah caught a glint of reflected light from the hills to the southeast. Her training kicked in immediately as she swung her scope toward the location. "Movement at suspect position 1, she whispered into her radio. "Possible sniper, range 2,100 yards. Through her scope, she could now see a figure in camouflage gear, positioning what was unmistakably a Barrett rifle. The sniper was nearly invisible against the hillside. But Sarah's weeks of training had taught her to spot the subtle signs, the unnatural straight lines of a rifle barrel. The slight movement of vegetation being disturbed. "Confirmed hostile sniper at position 1, she reported. "Adult male with Barrett system, targeting the ceremony. "Alpha team." "You are cleared to engage," came Peterson's immediate response. Sarah began her calculations, factoring in the extreme range, wind conditions, and elevation differences. 2,100 yards was at the very edge of what was possible, even with the Barrett system. The target was partially concealed, offering only a narrow window for a successful shot. She controlled her breathing, her body settling into perfect stillness. Through the scope, she could see the enemy sniper making his own final adjustments. Preparing to fire on the ceremony below, the trigger broke cleanly, and Sarah immediately began tracking her bullet's flight. At this extreme range, it would take nearly 3 seconds to reach the target. She watched through her scope as the distant figure suddenly jerked and fell from view. "Target down at position 1, she reported, but before she could fully savor the success, another glint caught her eye from a different location entirely, not one of the suspected positions, but a completely new threat. New contact. She called urgently. "Sniper at unexpected position, bearing northwest, range approximately 1,800 yards. This shooter was already in position and appeared ready to fire. Sarah quickly swung her rifle toward the new threat. Knowing she had seconds at most before the enemy sniper could engage the ceremony, taking immediate action, she announced, not waiting for clearance. The second shot was rushed, compared to her usual methodical approach, but her training took over. The rifle thundered, 1,800 yards away. The second threat was neutralized. "Second target down," she reported, but even as she spoke, she caught movement at the third suspected position. "Multiple contacts now active," she called into her radio. "This is a coordinated attack." The third sniper was at a range that put him within reach of Bravo Team's position. "Bravo Team, you have a target at position 3. Range 1,200 yards. "Bravo Team engaging," came the immediate response. Sarah continued scanning through her scope, knowing that intelligence had suggested 4 attackers total. Where was the 4th? Her question was answered when her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Charlie Team. "Charlie Team has contact?" "Sniper at close range, approximately 800 yards, already engaging the ceremony." Through her scope, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the ceremony area as the 4th sniper fired at the reviewing stand. Military personnel were scattering for cover, but the range was close enough that the enemy sniper was hitting his targets. Charlie team, neutralize that threat immediately. Peterson's voice was sharp with urgency. Charlie team taking fire, came the response. Unable to engage, were pinned down. Sarah realized that the fourth sniper had positioned himself specifically to counter Charlie team, leaving the ceremony vulnerable to continued attack. The range to his position was nearly 2,500 yards from her location, beyond the effective range of any sniper rifle. But as she watched through her scope, the enemy sniper was firing from an elevated position that brought him into her sight line, just barely within the theoretical maximum range of the Barrett system. Alpha team, attempting engagement at extreme range, she reported. All teams maintain position. The shot would be at the absolute limits of physics and equipment. The bullet would take over 3 seconds to reach the target, dropping more than 30 feet during its flight. Wind would have enormous effect over such a distance, and the target was small and partially concealed. Sarah made her calculations quickly, knowing every second of delay meant more casualties below. She dialed in massive amounts of elevation and windage, pushing her scope adjustments to their limits. Through her scope, she could barely make out the distant muzzle flashes as the enemy sniper continued his attack on the ceremony. Military personnel were returning fire with shorter-range weapons, but they couldn't reach him at his elevated position. Sarah controlled her breathing one final time. Knowing this shot would determine the outcome of the entire operation, the mathematics were pushing beyond what she'd ever attempted. But her father's voice echoed in her memory. Trust your training. Trust your instincts, and trust the rifle. The trigger broke, and Sarah watched the bullet's long arc through the morning air. 3.5 seconds later, the distant muzzle flashes stopped. Target neutralized, she reported. All threats appear to be down. The radio was silent for a moment before Peterson's voice came through. All teams report status. Bravo team, target down at position 3. Charlie team, we're secure. No more incoming fire. It's Alpha team, for confirmed targets neutralized. Peterson's voice carried a note of amazement. Alpha team, confirm your last engagement range. Sarah checked her rangefinder one more time. Range 2 final target was 2,450 yards. There was a long pause before Peterson responded. Outstanding work, all teams. Threat neutralized. Ceremony secured. As Sarah secured her rifle and prepared to move from her position, she realized that in the space of less than 10 minutes, she had engaged targets at ranges that pushed the Barrett system to its absolute limits. The skills her father had taught her, combined with weeks of intensive military training, had been enough to prevent what could have been a catastrophic attack. Later that evening, after the extensive debriefing and security procedures, Colonel Peterson found Sarah in the base mess hall. She was sitting alone, still processing the events of the day. Mind if I join you? He asked. Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. Of course, sir. Peterson sat down, studying her face. How are you holding up? I keep thinking about that last shot, Sarah said quietly. 2,400 yards. My father always said I could shoot the wings off a fly, but I never imagined anything like that. Your father would be proud, Peterson said. What you did today saved lives, potentially dozens of them. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. The men at Wilson's gun shop, they thought I couldn't handle a Barrett rifle. They thought I wasn't cut out for this kind of shooting. Peterson smiled slightly. I think it's safe to say you've proven them wrong. In fact, I've been authorized to offer you a permanent position with our specialized operations unit. The pay is substantial, and the work is. He paused. ... Important. Sarah considered the offer for a long moment. Can I think about it? This has all been so much more than I expected when I first walked into that gun shop, of course. Take all the time you need. Peterson stood to leave, then turned back. But I want you to know something. In 28 years of military service, I've never seen shooting like what you demonstrated today. Whatever you decide about the job offer, you've earned a place in the history of military marksmanship. As Sarah sat alone in the mess hall, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a physics teacher looking to honor her father's memory to a counter-sniper who had just prevented a terrorist attack with. Shots that defied conventional wisdom about what was possible. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Wilson's Gun Emporium in her contacts. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay them a visit. She had a feeling their attitudes about who was cut out for Barrett rifles might have changed considerably. The gun shop crew had scoffed that women weren't cut out for Barrett rifles. The general had spotted his sniper, and together they had proven that exceptional skill knows no boundaries. Sometimes the most